Hello and welcome to my YouTube channel. My name is Jane and today I am going to be talking all about knitted sports knickers from just before the First World War. Now, have no fear, this is not going to be one of those episodes where I knit the sports knickers and model them for you. Knitted sports knickers are never ever going to have a place in my maker's wardrobe. Instead, this is something that I started doing as sort of a bit of research for the studio, but it grew legs and I thought I would bring it here instead. The studio is an online creative community that I run, and every 6 months we take a particular period of time and we do some making that is loosely based on that, try lots of different techniques towards making an overall project. But at the same time, we're looking at, the way people lived, things that people were making, the whole of the creative culture, I suppose, and particularly women's lives. So as part of this, I like to kind of rabbit hole a little bit, do some research around books and so on that were available at the time. In this 6 months, we are looking at 1900 to around about 1915, and we've based it all around Edith Holden's work. If you're alive in the 1980s, you may remember A Country Diary of an Edwardian Lady. That was Edith Holden's work. And I have been buying things and looking at things around that. And one of the books that I acquired was this one. You can see it's called The Modern Knitting Book. And it is a book of ideas for knitted underwear, coats and wraps, caps and hoods, babies and children's garments, socks and stockings, and also new patterns in fancy knitting. And it is edited by Flora Klickmann. And this was brought out in 1915, so right at the end of our period. This was a really interesting point in knitting because most knitting had traditionally been done really as sort of part of a domestic economy. As people hand knitted socks and stockings and sold them. People would knit socks, stockings, babies wear, children's wear, hats, mittens, for their own families. But there was very few garments being made. There are some, and there is one in this book, but that wasn't the main thrust of things. And what happened was that during the First World War, people took up knitting so that they could knit things to send out to the front. Soldiers' comforts, and that changed the amount of people knitting. It changed the kinds of things that they were wanting to knit, and knitting pattern books in the 1920s are very different from those in pre-World War I. So this book, which has lots of adverts, interestingly, starts off with men's wear, which I wasn't particularly interested in, but I do think that this body belt is quite hilarious. And then we get to women's wear. And the first thing, things for women's wear, the first thing that we have is this cozy sleeping hood. And this reminds me so much of Little Red Riding Hood. When the wolf dresses up as a grandmother, he has one of these hoods on, and I do think it is so like this hood here. And it's for somebody who is in bed, just to keep them a little bit warmer. And interestingly, this book, which is a knitting book, has kind of vaguely religious quotes on the bottom of it here. This says, "Do not pray for easy lives, pray to be stronger men." Then we have the garment that is in the book, and this is, rather than having a costly fur coat, you could knit yourself a jacket and then knit it in special teasel wool, which is kind of a bit like a mohair, and then brush it so that it becomes very fluffy. This was incredibly popular as a concept. But then we get into knitted vests, knitted wraps, lots of hats, ribbed stockings, plain stockings, and then sports knickers. Now, I had never seen sports knickers in any of my books. None of my books have sports knickers in them. And it describes it as specially designed on simple lines for those who have had little experience in knitting, and also for those who like to use up spare minutes with this work. The knickers illustrated were made of J.J. Baldwin's fast navy 4-ply beehive double knitting wool, and we would particularly recommend the use of this quality if a really durable garment for heavy sportswear is required. This wool is particularly strong and is warranted not to shrink and not to lose its colour in washing. So these are not kind of activity knickers, really. They're not just for, going out walking, I don't think. These are sports knickers. These are for rough and tumble. They're navy blue. They are not white. They are put onto a waistband here that has buttons, and the back has a flap. So these were not an outer garment. These were an undergarment, right? Because no woman in 1915 would be having that kind of flap at the back. So I thought this is really interesting. And I went out searching to find some other sports knickers, Googling patterns. Ravelry is often very good for this, because people have listed lots of patterns. And there I found some sports knickers in an Australian newspaper in New South Wales. Clicked through the link, and yes, it was sports knickers, but it was this exact same pattern, exactly the same, but a few months earlier. So it was in 1914 rather than 1915. And that suggests syndication. But I couldn't see that it would necessarily have gone from the Australian newspaper into a book. So I started to look for an earlier thing that both this book and the Australian newspaper could have drawn from. So I decided to start with Flora Klickmann. Now, Flora Klickmann edited this, but she was also the editor of a thing called The Girl's Own Paper. So Flora Klickmann is a really interesting person. She was one of 6 children of a German immigrant family living in London. And originally she wanted to be a concert pianist, and she studied at Trinity Music College. But a heart problem stopped her becoming a professional performer. So whether that was anxiety related, like stage fright kind of thing, it's not very clear. And she decided instead that she would teach music, but also become a kind of a journalist, jobbing journalist, really, freelance journalist. And she wrote for a Methodist missionary magazine, and she wrote for Windsor, I think it's called, which was all about royalty. And she seems to have stacked lots of jobs on each other. But then in 1908, I think it was, 1908, her mother was dead. She was in her mid-30s, living in the family home. Her father remarried and moved out. And at the same time, she took on the editorship of the Girl's Own Paper. Girl's Own Paper is a really, really popular magazine aimed at teenage girls. It's produced by the Religious Tract Society. It has a circulation of about 200,000. It's incredibly popular. And she took it on when the previous editor died. Now, the previous editor had been one of the founders of Trinity Music College. So you can see all of these connections kind of coming round. But it looks as though she continued to do her other journalism work, her music teaching, took on the editorship of this new magazine. And so I went searching for the Girls' Own Annual. This is bound editions of all of the Girls' Own papers for like a year. I found this online, £10 from an online bookshop. And it's not in brilliant condition. Some of the pages are a bit wobbly. But it is the most amazing resource. So I started, here we go, poor condition, £10. Girls' Own Annual, edited by Flora Klickmann. And these magazines are really interesting because, yes, they have lots of stories in them, kind of vaguely romancy stories. They have a lot of royal stuff, which I assume she was just bringing over from her journalism for the royalty magazine. And then there's things about taxing a woman's marriage, an article for married women with incomes of their own, which tells of some anomalies lately brought to light and how the income of husband and wife is made to bear burdens jointly that could not be imposed separately. So here you go, you've got some financial advice for women. You've got what you should do if somebody proposes and you don't want to get engaged. Educating your child at home. So you can see this has moved from being a teenage magazine to being something that is more about women, how to make a beautiful home. But fortunately for me, it did have some knitting patterns in it and things like from making a child's bedspread, how to make coats and hats and all kinds of things. I kept going because this is from 1913, this early part, and it then goes into 1914. And then I saw, the Cozy Sleeping Hood is in here, and I became very excited. And I thought, well, if the Cozy Sleeping Hood is here, and it is described as designed by the editor for elderly ladies who feel the need at night of protection from drafts. If that is in here, and if she designed it for the magazine, then I think we've found our earliest ones. And I continued on and on about the new fireless cooker, toy animals, and then I found the knitted sports knickers. There we go. And that kind of makes sense to me. You have these knitted sports knickers that have been designed by the editor of a magazine that is really for teenage girls and young women. Teenage girls and young women who are becoming much more active, who are taking part in sports like football. This was the heyday of women's professional football, and that went out into kind of the world generally. And if you're going to play football, and you're going to play football in your sort of like ankle length skirts, you're going to want some sturdy, strong, unshrinkable sports knickers underneath that. Not your white knickers, because that showing of a little bit of lace as you ran along would be seen as provocative. But having these, frankly, really not very alluring sports knickers underneath it do not in the same way. So that is the world that we are coming into. And what I find really interesting is that this magazine, which is published by a religious body and whose mission kind of statement. I'm sure they didn't have mission statements, but the mission was to really demonstrate life within a Christian world. When it started off, it was very much missionary focused, I think. But under Flora Klickmann's rule, this becomes somewhere where there are articles about, exercise for girls, legal stuff, about how to get into journalism, about how to make money, all of these kinds of things interspersed with romantic stories, gardening, cooking, making your sports knickers. I think it's very interesting that this has been designed for somebody who hasn't done much knitting before. So maybe it's the person who is doing the sport. These is not a natural knitter, and these are going to be really easy for her to knit. Who knows? But I find it fascinating. And the other thing that I find really interesting is that this is before the First World War. This is right at the time of, the suffragettes, the suffragists, women wanting more rights, women campaigning for access to their own money, as we saw, all of these kinds of things. And the history books tend to sort of say that women got more active during the First World War, that it was because they took on men's jobs, that they took up sport as well, that all of these kinds of things. But this is clear that it wasn't quite like that. It was much more nuanced. If by 1913, this quite conservative magazine was producing original patterns for knitted sports knickers, that suggests that there is a demand. This is not a magazine at the forefront of anything. This is a magazine that responds to what is already happening in society. So that shows that women were already participating in sports that needed your sturdy sports knickers. They were already rushing around after a ball, maybe, kicking up their skirts, showing off the navy blue bloomers underneath. So I find it very, very interesting. And this is why I love primary source materials, because you can also see what is next to it. So we have the knitted sports knickers, and then we have the how to make toy animals. Both crafts, but also from a social history point of view, very, very different. So there we are. I just love these magazines. And if you ever come across one in a second-hand bookshop, then I would say, buy it and just spend your time flicking through, and it will tell you an awful lot more about how people lived and what mattered to them and what was coming up at that particular time than any history book will. So I'm not often at the sports knickers, but I will photograph the page and I will put that on the blog that goes with this particular YouTube, so that if anybody does fancy making some 1914 sports knickers, they can go ahead and let me know how they turn out. Until next Friday, bye bye.